Hello ladies and gentlemen, my name is Garrett Mills. Welcome to installing a basic PHP development environment on Mac OS. Now, there are videos on how to do this in every OS, so if you don't happen to use Mac OS on a daily basis, feel free to check out some of the other videos. In this environment, we will be setting up PHP with Composer and a lamp stack, whether that is Homebrew or just a straight web server running in macOS. Now, a few things to note. I am using a special terminal program called Black Screen because I like the way it looks, but this is essentially the same as using the terminal app in Mac. So, with that out of the way, we're going to get started installing Homebrew. Now, OS X is Unix based, which means that it follows a standard layout for an operating system, much like Linux. But unlike Linux, one thing that macOS doesn't come with is a package manager. A package manager is essentially a centralized program that you can use to install, maintain, update other programs from like one entry point, whether that's a command line or an app store. Now, it does have an app store, but because so much of development is command line based, it is useful to have a command line package manager. And for that, we have Homebrew. Homebrew is, as the tagline indicates, the missing package manager for OS X. It is maintained by a community and functions very well as just a native package manager to run from an OS X terminal. So the first thing we're going to want to do is install this. So if you go to brew.sh in your favorite web browser and copy the install link, and then just paste that into a shell and hit enter. And what this script is going to do is it tells you at the top it's going to install the Homebrew libraries and binary files and then create the directories for all of the programs. Now the nice thing about Homebrew is if necessary you can change where it installs Homebrew to, and it's completely self-contained, so it will never put files in random places, so you know when you uninstall Homebrew it is uninstalled cleanly. So we're going to go ahead and hit enter, and the process should just complete automatically. So it'll ask for your password first off, put that in, and then it's going to install and make all the directories. Alright, so now that that's finished, we can keep working on installing the rest of our development tools. So one thing that Apple does in their macOS is they include a basic set of common programs that you might need, such as PHP. However, the version of PHP that ships by default in macOS, at least El Capitan, the version I'm using, is not quite up to date for some of the frameworks and plugins and extensions that you might need to use in your development. So one nice thing we can do with Homebrew is by running just a few simple commands, we can update PHP to whatever version we want transparently without removing the built-in OS version. So if at any point you need to revert back to the Mac OS default version of PHP for any reason, that's still an option. So the first thing we have to do is add the repositories, which is basically just collections of programs. We need to add the repositories needed to install PHP, and we're going to do that by using 3 commands, all run through Homebrew. So brew tap is just the command to add a repository. Homebrew /dupes. After that, we can run brew tap homebrew /versions. After that, we can install the final repository, which contains the PHP executables, by running brew tap homebrew /homebrew PHP. And now we're ready to install PHP. So there's a standard form for this. Whenever you're installing a program using brew, you run brew install, then the name of the program. So in this case, we want to install PHP version 5.6. So we want to install PHP 5.6. If, for instance, your development environment required you to use PHP version 7, you can just delete that and run PHP 7.0 to install PHP version 7.0. But like I said, we're going to install PHP 5.6, so we're going to just run brew install PHP 5.6. So what this is going to do is it's going to download all of the dependencies such as libpng, freetype, gettext, etc. from the Homebrew repositories and install those automatically, and then it will download and install the PHP 5.6, whatever the latest version is, to your computer and cleanly replace the bin files for the current version. So now that this is finished, we can see that it spit out some useful information that we might want to note down, such as how to export the PHP directory into our path, where the default PHP ini file and Apache extension directories are. That's just some useful information that we can note down. Now that it's finished, though, we can check to make sure it updated and pushed the command line version out properly by running php-v to print out the version, and you can see indeed it installed version 5.6. So now that that is done, we are going to install a couple more useful little tools to have. The first is wget. And if you're not familiar with wget, this is a command that comes almost ubiquitous on all Linux systems, and it's just a command line tool for downloading scripts over HTTP. So this is used in a lot of development, particularly where you need to use external libraries or external script files, and so it's way easier to just run wget and download a file than it is to open a web browser, download the file, find the directory, move it where it's supposed to be, and then run it. So you can install this by running brew install wget. So once that's done, we can verify that it's installed by running which wget, and we see it installed properly. And if you just run wget by itself, obviously it's going to throw an error, but the way you would use this is you can run wget and then put in a URL of a file, and it will download that file to whatever directory you're currently in. You can see that I'm in my home directory at the moment. Now the next command line tool we're going to install is called Composer. In the same way that Homebrew is a package manager for OS X, Composer is a package manager for PHP. It allows PHP developers to pull standardized libraries with standardized dependencies so that they don't have to reinvent the wheel every time. So say you invent a neat little snippet of code that's incredibly useful and saves like hours worth of programming. You can push that up using Composer, and other developers can require it and use it in their programs by using Composer instead of every developer having to reinvent the wheel every time something's done. Composer is used an insane amount in PHP development. It is incredibly important and incredibly powerful tool to have. So we're going to install it using Homebrew again by running brew install Composer. So that was really easy. We can verify that it's installed properly by running Composer. And you should see the standard Composer output. Now, even though we've installed PHP and Composer and all that, we're still not quite ready to develop in PHP yet. That's because there's one vital piece missing, and that's the LAMP stack. A LAMP stack is any server database combination that is used to execute PHP and serve pages to a user. And because PHP is a server-side scripting language, this is a requirement for developing in PHP. Now in macOS, there's two routes you can go here. You can either just directly install a web server / database system on macOS and develop that way, and that works, but it's really difficult sometimes to manage your dependencies and keep everything updated inside OS X, and that leads me to the second method, which is called Scotchbox. Scotchbox is a virtual machine, and if you're unfamiliar with the term virtual machine, give it a quick Google, but basically it's a computer that runs in a computer. It's a virtual machine that comes preloaded with the server, the database software, all the plugins, everything completely up to date and ready to handle anything you're going to be able to throw at it. And this is definitely the most recommended way of doing it because it keeps it separate from your main system. Plus, when you aren't using it, you can just shut it down and it's out of the way, as opposed to having to turn off a web server and a database server and all that on your main machine just to use it. So, this section of the video is going to be how to install Scotchbox, the virtual machine. But if your computer doesn't support virtualization, which is needed for running virtual machines, feel free to skip ahead in the video and we will install the local LAMP stack just on the Mac, and that will work just fine. So to install Scotchbox, we need three things. First off is some virtual machine platform for it to run on. That may be VirtualBox, which is what we're going to use in this example, or if you've already paid money and you use something such as VMware, that it'll work with that too. On top of that, we need a command line tool called Vagrant, and Vagrant is just a command line way of accessing and running virtual machines through whatever virtualization program you use. And then we actually install Scotchbox using Vagrant. So first off, we're going to download and install VirtualBox. This can be done by going to virtualbox.org, and I'll put all these links in the description, and clicking the big blue Download VirtualBox 5.1 button. Then selecting the AMD 64 option for Mac OS X and clicking Save. Alright, so once that finishes downloading, it's basically like installing any other OS X application. Just let it mount the DMG file. Double click the icon and it'll open the standard installer. And basically mash the continue button through to the end. Once that finishes, you can go ahead and open your applications folder, and if you scroll to the bottom you should see the VirtualBox application, which we can go ahead and open to verify that it installed properly. Now you won't really interact with this much unless you're using it for other things, so we can actually go ahead and close out of this and proceed to install Vagrant. Now Vagrant is another little useful tool that you simply download and install. It's a command line interface for interacting with and using VirtualBox, and it just makes provisioning, which is creating pre-made VMs, so much easier and so much more context oriented than opening it in the actual GUI. So you can navigate to the Vagrant website and go to the downloads page, and I'll put a link to this in the description, and click the download button for Mac OS X and download the file. Alright, so once that's downloaded, it follows the same standard pattern of click, click, install. So we simply click it to launch and mount the DMG volume, and then run the Vagrant install wizard, tabbing through continue, typing in passwords where needed until it's installed. So once the wizard finishes, again, just close out of everything, and you should now be able to use the Vagrant command line tool. So running Vagrant-V shows that we have properly installed Vagrant version 1.8.5. And so at this point, we're ready to actually install Scotchbox, which means it's time to make a couple of decisions about where you want your code to live. Personally, I prefer putting it in my documents folder so I know where it is, but it's not always taking up a bunch of room. So it's really up to personal preference. So just change directories into where you want it, make the folder, CD into the folder, and you're ready to go. So if we go look at the Scotchbox website, you can see it's as easy as just about 2 steps. Scroll down to step 3, we've already done 1 and 2, and copy the git clone command. What this is going to do is, when executed, it is going to clone the Scotchbox repository, which is just all the files required for Scotchbox, into the folder of your choosing. So you can delete the part where it says My Project and rename it whatever you want. So I'm going to rename it Scotch just for clarity. And then hit enter, and it will clone the repository into the folder Scotch. We can verify this by doing a quick ls, and you can see the folder Scotch now exists. So what you're going to want to do is cd into the Scotch folder, and you should see 3 files: a readme, a Vagrant file, and the public folder. The reason you only see 3 files in here now is because the VM has not been fully installed. What we're going to do now is run the command vagrant up. What this will do is on the first run, it will download and provision the virtual machine, and then it will bring it online. After the first time, it no longer has to download it, so it will be significantly faster. However, the first run is going to take it a while because it has to fully download the entire virtual machine and set it up. So be prepared to wait a little bit. So a little more about Vagrant. Vagrant is a command line tool that allows you to, one, interact with VirtualBox through the command line, which is very useful, but two, it allows you to use pre-built virtual machines that other people have created. And that makes it incredibly powerful because you no longer have to configure every single operating system like we're doing now. You can use a pre-built virtual machine, and it can do any specific set of tasks that you need without requiring an extensive setup or even an extensive knowledge of how virtual machines work. So like I said, the first time you run the command vagrant up, it's going to take a while to download and provision the VM. After that, it'll be relatively quick. So a few things to note before we move away from here. In order to interact with this specific VM, you have to be in the Scotch directory or lower, which means that say you have a folder in the Scotch directory called public, you can be in public and still interact with the VM through Vagrant, but you have to at least be in the Scotch directory. A few important commands to note is the vagrant up command, of course, which is used to start your VM. By default, when you boot your computer, your virtual machines are all off. That way it doesn't create a lot of startup overhead. And then the other important command to note is vagrant halt. This will safely shut down your virtual machine by SSHing into it, running all the proper commands, and then turning off the virtual machine after the operating system has correctly shut down. So those are the basic 2 commands that you need to know to run Vagrant. So now we're going to go ahead and run Vagrant up again just to make sure it turns on, and you'll see what it looks like normally, and it will take a lot less time. Alright, so that's the VM back online. Now, by default, when you install Scotchbox, it mounts it to a certain IP address, so we can test and make sure that it's installed by navigating to 192.168.33.10. And if we've installed Scotchbox and it's running properly, you should see the Welcome to Scotchbox page. And this has a lot of useful info like what tools are installed, what database and caching and node tools are installed, as well as the credentials you may need to access MySQL, Postgre, Mongo, Mailcatcher, and all the different tools included with this environment. So if you need to access the command line in your Scotchbox for any reason, you'll need to run vagrant SSH. And what this will do is it will drop you into the bash shell for your Scotchbox. Now Scotchbox is based on Ubuntu 14.04, as you can see right here. So this is stock Ubuntu, which means you can do things like sudo and whatnot. So it is running Apache, so if you go to the var www directory, you can see that the public directory is there. And now an important thing to note is the public directory in your VM syncs with the public directory in your code folder. So if we navigate to the code folder that we created last time, you can go to the public folder in there and you see that it syncs the 2 directories. So what this enables us to do is we can use whatever development environment we want, whether it's PHPStorm or Eclipse or whatever, and we can develop locally on the machine, but then it syncs with the virtual machine so we can actually use the virtual machine through the browser to test our code. Now another important thing to note is if you have to do anything with the database through the command line, you will need to SSH into your virtual machine to do that because the database is on the virtual machine and not the local environment. Now once we've got Scotchbox installed, we're ready to set up our development environment. So you can go ahead and click now to skip through the direct web server setup portion of the video, and skip straight to installing and setting up a development environment. Now, if for whatever reason you don't want to use Scotchbox, or if your computer doesn't support virtualization, you can install the web server and the database tools all locally directly on your Mac. I don't normally recommend this if you can handle Scotchbox because it's a lot messier and it requires a lot of careful just making sure you don't mess up your system by changing anything that may be required by the web server. Plus, if you ever need to completely uninstall it, it's a little more involved than just deleting the VM. However, installation of this is fairly simple thanks to a program called XAMPP. XAMPP is similar to LAMP and WAMP and all the other AMP derivatives in that it contains a full LAMP stack supported for OS X. So what you're going to want to do is select the version for PHP 5.6, which is what we have installed on our computer, or just select the one corresponding to whatever version you're using, and then hit download. So once that's done downloading, it's just a matter of the standard click install method. Open the DMG and run the installer. Type in passwords where needed and tab continue through completion. So running through the XAMPP setup wizard, there are a few things that we need to know. You do indeed want the developer files since we're developing on XAMPP, and that gives us a bit more of a complete platform. You might want to take note of where it's going to be installed, although it's fairly easy to note. I want to uncheck that because it just opens a web link to the Bitnami website. If you haven't used Bitnami before, it is kind of a useful tool because it lets you install things like WordPress, Drupal, whatnot by just like clicking an install wizard. But we don't really care about that in this case. So hit next and just wait for the install to finish. So once that's installed, it's a simple matter of closing out of the wizard and the window, and now we can go to our applications folder, scroll to the bottom, go to the XAMPP folder, and launch the manager. This, of course, will require administrative permissions because it has to run a lot of things that supersede what would be capable in the user space. It has to run at the system level since they are system processes. So once the manager opens, you can see that we have a few different things. You can look in here and see all the servers that are currently installed. So we've got a MySQL database, an FTP server, and the Apache web server. We can go ahead and hit Start All just to make sure that it's going to work properly. So if you click the Start All button and you run into a problem that looks something like this, where the MySQL server and the FTP server start but the web server won't, don't panic. Apple ships OS X with a default built-in Apache server. We want to disable this before we try and start the XAMPP server. That is the reason it fails. So to do that, we simply run the command sudo apachectl stop. What this will do is it'll stop the built-in Mac OS Apache server and will allow us to start the XAMPP Apache server. So if we click the Start button, it will attempt to bind the Apache web server where the old Apache web server was, and we should get a green light. You can now jump over to whatever favorite browser you happen to be using, navigate to localhost, and you should see a page that looks something like this. If you see a page that looks like this, it means that the Apache web server is up and running properly. So, one last thing we're going to want to do, just for ease of use, is if you navigate to the Applications XAMPP folder, you'll notice that there's a folder called htdocs. This htdocs folder is the folder where all of your code will need to go in order to be accessed through the server. This is sometimes called the public root. It is the directory that is accessible through the server. And in order to make this easier to access and easier to work with, we should put a link to it wherever you want to be writing your code through. So to do this, just hit right click, make alias, then hit copy, go to wherever you're wanting to keep your code. In my case, I'm keeping it in documents/code, hold Alt and right click, and click Move Item here. Then you can rename it to whatever you want. One final thing to note about XAMPP is when you're not developing or testing your code or web apps, you'll want to go ahead and hit the Stop All button in the Manager app because these require a fair amount of overhead to keep running. Now that you've got XAMPP installed and running, we can go ahead and move into the section of the video where we discuss what IDE is right for you. The first of these is called PHPStorm, and it's by a company called JetBrains. Now, PHPStorm is probably one of the most popular PHP development environments in existence because it's got such an enormous range of features, plugins, everything. It is a beast of an IDE. However, it comes with a pretty steep price tag. So if you don't intend to develop professionally or work on projects with thousands upon thousands of files of code that you interact with at any given point in time, this probably isn't for you. But if you do intend to do those things at this point, or if you're working on a big project or a professional project, PHPStorm is definitely the way to go. It's worth the price. Plus, if you're a student, you can generally sign up for a JetBrains account with your student email address for whatever institution you go to school at. You can then sign up as a student and get a free license for PHPStorm for however long if you qualify. Now the other IDE that we're going to look at is called Eclipse. Now Eclipse is traditionally thought of as a Java development environment, but the folks over at the Eclipse organization have put together many different spin-offs of it capable of developing in many different platforms, which is fantastic. Eclipse is open source, which means it's free. It is a fully featured IDE, but it's not quite as powerful and doesn't offer some of the same GUI tools as PHPStorm does. But if you're just planning on developing in your free time, or if you're just getting started, Eclipse is a great free entry point to just sort of test the water. And even for some larger projects, Eclipse is still a fantastic development environment. So you just need to choose. If you're on the fence, I would recommend just try Eclipse. And if you like it, go with it. And if you don't like it, maybe try PHPStorm. So we're going to walk through installing both of these depending on which one you choose. At this point, we're going to start installing PHPStorm. So it's a fairly straightforward process. You're going to want to download the 211 megabyte OSX DMG file from the JetBrains website. So once that's done, it basically follows the same click, click, install method as every other Mac program. Click the downloaded file to mount the DMG archive. And drag the PHPStorm file into the applications folder. Once that's done, you can go ahead and close the archive, go to your applications folder, and launch PHPStorm. Now as you can see, my copy of PHPStorm is already licensed. However, the first time you run your installation, it'll walk you through a wizard to put in your license key or sign in with your applicable JetBrains account. Then it'll open up another window asking you to customize the colors to your liking, and it'll restart and eventually drop you at a window that looks something like this. However, you're still not quite ready to begin developing because we have to tell PHPStorm where to look for PHP. To do this, we can go down to Configure and select Preferences. Then, click on Languages and Frameworks, PHP, and click the three little dots next to the word No Interpreter. Now we can click the plus button, but do not click user/bin/php because that is the Mac default PHP, not the 5.6 version that we installed ourselves. Instead, you're going to want to click on the words Other Local. Once you do that, it should drop you at a window that looks something like this. We'll want to go ahead and change the name so that we know it is the version installed by Homebrew. Next, we need to tell it where to look. So to do this, we're going to want to point it to the PHP 5.6 or whatever version you're using in the Homebrew directory. This is located under User, Local, Seller. The seller directory is where Homebrew installs all of its applications. Scroll down until you see PHP 5.6 or whatever version you're using, 5.6.25_1. Open the bin folder, click the PHP executable, and click OK. PHPStorm should detect the PHP version that you're using, and it should point out the configuration file that it's going to read. You may want to take note of this because it may be useful in the future. Next, click OK, and now you are ready to begin developing. At this point, you've successfully set up PHPStorm, and you're now ready to begin developing by clicking Create New Project and selecting the project type. Go ahead and click anywhere on the screen to jump to the conclusion. Alright, so if you've decided to use Eclipse, it's fairly easy to install. Just go to the Eclipse downloads page, I'll put the link in the description, and click Download next to Eclipse for PHP Developers. Then hit Download. I recommend going through one of the members because it is genuinely faster than downloading it through the Eclipse servers. Hitting Save File and waiting for it to download. Alright, so once that finishes downloading, we can go ahead and open it in Finder and extract the archive. This will take just a second as it is rather large. Once that's done, you're left with the Eclipse application, which you can copy, go to the Applications folder, hold the Option key, and click Move. Once that's done, we should be able to go to our Applications folder and click Eclipse. Now you might notice an issue here. You can see that I've got Eclipse for Java installed and Eclipse installed. This can be a bit of a pain to tell them apart. So one thing that I recommend doing is finding the Eclipse application and renaming it after whatever code it is used to write. So in this case, Eclipse for PHP. You can then launch it and it will start the latest version of Eclipse. After launching, Eclipse will open a window asking you to choose what directory you want to use as your workspace. The workspace is where Eclipse stores all the folders and files in whatever projects you create. Now, after installing your development environment, you're going to want to point this toward the public root of whatever LAMP solution you used. So if you choose to use Scotchbox, you're going to want to point this towards the Scotchbox public folder that we added into the code folder in our documents. Or if you're using the examp stack, you're going to want to point this toward that public htdocs folder that we put in our code folder in our documents directory. So you can do that by selecting Browse and navigating to the folder. Selecting Open, and then OK. After selecting your workspace, Eclipse will then load the actual editor and you'll be dropped at a welcome page. The first time that you run Eclipse, I recommend going through the configuration settings wizard and customizing it to your liking. After going through the wizard, you have now successfully set up Eclipse for PHP development and you're ready to get started by clicking Create New PHP Project, naming it, and it will open the editor in your workspace. Alright guys, so whether you installed Scotchbox or Examp, PHPStorm or Eclipse or some other IDE, you're now ready to get started with PHP development. So be sure to subscribe and check out the rest of my series on getting started with PHP development or other code features and tutorials. Thank you.